My name is Charles Levitt. I'm an associate professor of Italian and film and the associate director of the Center for Italian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this afternoon's Italian Research Seminar, and happy to introduce our speaker for today, who is Elisa Brilli. She's professor of Italian Studies at the Department of Italian Studies at the University of Toronto, where she's been since 2015. She's a specialist in Dante studies with an interest in the interactions between history and literature, medieval exemplary literature, and historiography. She's also the director of the Center for Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto. Her monograph is Firenze e il Profeta, which came out with Carocci in 2012. It provides the first comprehensive analysis of the depiction of Florence in Dante's works from three perspectives: its dialogue with civic memory, its reshaping of theological paradigms, and its autobiographical implications. And she's also the editor, or the chief editor, of the critical edition of the Alphabetum Narrationum of Arnold de Liege, a 14th century collection of 800 exemplary tales, which came out in 2015, and the co-editor of a number of collective volumes and the author of various articles and essays relevant to Dante, Boccaccio, the reception of Dante's works, and the reception of Augustine's De Civitate Dei in medieval and early modern culture. Her 2021 book, which is the occasion for today's lecture, is Vite, nuove, Biografia e autobiografia di Dante, which was written with Giuliano Milani and published by Carocci. And it's been called the major biographical study on Dante of the last few decades, and one of the fundamental points of reference for future works on this endlessly fascinating subject, as well as a necessary read for anyone interested in Florence at the turn of the 14th century and the intellectual culture that shaped it. And there's very good news for English language readers, which is that a translation is going to come out later this year. And Elisa is going to speak to us today, as you can see, on a biographical bet. So please join me in welcoming Elisa.
Thank you so much for the introduction, for this invitation. I'm really glad to be here. And I have, as Charles was mentioning, a very specific reason to thank you. The topic I'm presenting today, so the book that I co-authored with Giuliano Milani, Dante delle Nouvelle, published firstly by Fayard, and then into an Italian translation as Vite, nuove, Biografia e autobiografia di Dante, is not exactly a new book. It has been published a couple of years ago. And indeed, with Giuliano, we have been lucky enough to be invited to present it over 20 times so far, and we've also been involved in various dissemination activities, such as interviews. One has just been published on the Revue des Études Dantesques this month, but also other kind of activities, for instance, a docufiction, which was kind of a new thing for me to do and to try. But from our point of view, all of this has been happening so quickly and was happening differently from the pace to which, as scholars, we are accustomed. And as a result, we haven't had actually the chance to fully reflect on all the different inputs that we have been receiving. And we felt very stunned that we needed more time to try to develop a more nuanced idea of what we tried to do with this book. So today, instead of presenting this book once more, what I would like to do with you is just that, to pause and to think about the backstage and the implications of this, as I called it, biographical bet. And this is even more topical for us due to the English translation, which is about to appear for Reaktion Books later this year. So thank you for giving me this rare, I would say, opportunity to share some ex post thoughts on what we tried to do. And thank you in advance for your reactions, feedback, questions, and of course, if I say something that is not totally comprehensible, just make a sign, and I will try to explain myself a little better. So the fortune then. Although this book or these books are not a bestseller, and they certainly won't become rich because of them, as an academic author, the fact that they sold more than 10 times what my first monograph did, was a kind of cultural shock, because it implies the encounter with a completely different audience from the ones I'm used to. Of course, much of this was not out of our merit, but was due to the Dante's anniversary. This was a precondition completely independent from us and determined by the logic of the commemoration and, of course, by the laws of the editorial market. As a result, our work was immediately surrounded by other anniversary-driven publications, such as the multiple books by Cazzullo, or even the late Sant'Agata's book on Le Donne di Dante. And this also led the reviewers to cover the new biographies of Dante, including ours, the book by Barbero, and one book by Pellegrini, and more rarely, another beautiful book, Dante, by John Tooke, all together, both in newspapers and scholarly journals. And you can see here on the screen various case of collective reviews from French journals in particular, such Les Lire, Le Monde, Le Point, which is perhaps my favorite one due to its title, Dante pris en sandwich, which sounds like Dante caught into a sandwich, the two slices being Barbero on the one hand and Giuliano and myself on the other. So don't get me wrong, this public exposure was beneficial for sure in terms of visibility. Moreover, various reviewers, and thank you for recalling them, particularly the scholarly ones, expressed a clear preference for the novelties that our book was delivering. Nevertheless, the new temporal regime created by the anniversary, with this eternal, this sort of eternal present, with this continuous flow of chatting, twittering, commemorating, has resulted in a kind of historical and historiographical, perhaps, blackout, a sort of collective amnesia, and perhaps even a collective sense of being lost. Giuliano and I certainly felt a little bit lost, as if the long road that had led to our shared endeavor had been suddenly cancelled by the wind. Including in scholarly reviews and publications, they should be well aware of this path. And since we didn't have the time and actually the space to discuss all of this within the book, I think that it could be useful to provide an insight into the backstage of Dante's new lives. I tried to put together a kind of chronology, a cartography which is at the same time a chronology. Giuliano and I first met sometimes in between 2010 and 2011. At the time, Giuliano was already recognized as the most qualified historian of late medieval Italian banishments, because he had authored an influential monograph on the subject titled L'esclusione dal comune, 2003. I was, on the contrary, a much younger scholar, and I was at this time working on my first monograph, Firenze e il Profeta. And this is because of this that the late Alberto Azzurrosa thought of both of us, so Giuliano and I, to write two articles on Dante's exile from the side of history, Giuliano, and from the side of literary text, myself, which were published in 2011. It's interesting to know that at the time, Giuliano and I, we didn't know each other. We did not even exchange the articles that we were writing. But from this moment onwards, somehow we went on meeting each other over and over again and discussing particularly about the specific theme of Dante's exile. All of this already entered into my first monograph. This work actually came from my tesi di laurea, but due to this dialogue, I decided to add a completely new part to it, which was about the way in which the history of Florence is read by Dante to his poem, and at the same time, in comparison to the way in which the same history is retold in chronicles from before the time of Giovanni Villani. And somehow this part that now is the first chapter of that book was the result of this ongoing dialogue between me and other historians. Giuliano too went on working on Dante, and particularly he was responsible, together with others, with the so-called nuovo codice diplomatico dantesco. Can I assume that everyone knows what the codice diplomatico dantesco is? No, perhaps I will tell a word. The Codice Diplomatico is the collection of all the extant documents about Dante's life and Dante's family and people that perhaps have known Dante, that was edited by Renato Piattoli. And this work was commissioned by Michele Barbi to Renato Piattoli. But Giuliano realized that the documents published in the Codice Diplomatico Dantesco actually had some problems, both in terms of selection, edition of the documents themselves, and the way of presenting them by Piattoli, who was a paleographer and a specialist in diplomatics. He had no historical training, so the way in which the documents were interpreted was problematic at times. Together with this initiative, so the new edition of the edition of the Nuovo Codice Diplomatico Dantesco, Giuliano also started a series of meetings with another colleague of ours, Antonio Montefusco, named Dante attraverso I documenti. And the idea of these meetings was to put together historians and literary scholars to discuss about specific documentary evidence surrounding the life of Dante. So over the time, a significant amount of new documentary evidence and biographical knowledge was accumulating. And this prompted me to suggest to Justin Steinberg, when we were thinking in the reviews, in the editorial board of Dante Studies, about opening a new forum, so a new section of the review, to choose as main theme the question of Dante and biography. And this is a forum that has been published in 2018 and is opened by a piece of mine where I try to recap this history and also some other contributions that I will mention in a short while, but also ask some radical questions, like what are we studying, what's the purpose, what's the point, what we're trying to do. And this is also when Giuliano and I reconnected, because after reading the forum, a former colleague of mine who was working at Fayard approached me with the idea of writing a new biography in French of Dante. And of course I thought that this was a terrible idea, so I said no multiple times, but then I realized that actually could have been interesting if Giuliano agreed to write it with me, and if the editor allowed us to have creative control over the book structure and the content. So both of them, they said yes, and this is the incipit Vite nuove, if you want. The reason why I'm recalling all of this is to emphasize two factual points. The first one is that the development of our project spanned a period of about 10 years. During which the problems, the contents, and the ideas that shaped it were discovered and redefined. The second is that while Giuliano and I wrote the final product, the path towards Dante's new lives was a collective one. And by this, I do not mean that everyone involved agree with everything we wrote. Of course, they don't. Scholars never do, and they're not supposed to. But rather that the issues, the contents, and the ideas that informed our book emerged from this broader research. And this is something very common in natural sciences, in social sciences, but it happens a little bit less often, or at least is less acknowledged in the humanities. And I think it's important to keep this in mind because it's what explains why our book has a different approach and a different shape compared to the other recent biographies of Dante. So what are this approach and shape about? The reason why we accepted the proposal made by, okay, and these are other references that I will skip, but major milestones in this ongoing debate about the life of Dante. But all of this is really recapped in this forum I was mentioning before, if you are interested. So I was thinking, the reason why we accepted the proposal made by the editor-in-chief of the history section of Fayard, Pauline Labelle, is because we were attracted to the threefold écart that this editorial destination promised to offer to us. As Italian scholars who had been working on Dante for about a decade, we were excited at the idea of a book on Dante where nothing could be taken for granted about Dante, because no one in France reads Dante at school. And we were also drawn to the experiment of combining narrative with research and methodology in ways that are still rarely practiced in Italy. And we were excited by the idea of doing that in a language that was different both from our own native language and the one of the topic of our research. So there was this kind of triple displacement in the sense in which Carlo Ginzburg speaks of it, that was at once linguistic, disciplinary, and cultural. And this seemed to be like the best standpoint to meet our priorities after the season of studies we went through. We aimed to write an interdisciplinary book in the sense that we wanted to try to apply different research methodologies to the same broader object, here the life of Dante. We also wanted this book to be collaborative in order to reflect the collective path we came from, but also in order to be able to manage all the relevant scholarship with the same mastery. This is a practical point, but it is an important one when you think about working on an author like that. How can you master everything that has been published on him? You can't, but there are strategies through which you can do it a little bit better, perhaps. And finally, we wanted this book to be, I know this sounds stupid, interesting. We wanted to focus on question of relevance for the public, because we cannot go on giving for granted that people are interested in the life of Dante. Why should they? So these priorities also corresponded to three concerns that we had at the time. Various time in the season that I've just recapped, we have witnessed attempts to import new sources, but without changing the lens through which they were read. So, for example, if I come back to the case of Piattoli and some of his successors, many of the misreadings of documents relevant to Dante's life were in fact Dante-driven. They were caused by the fact that the questionnaire through which archival material was read strictly depended upon Dante's works, as well as the assumptions that were commonly made about them. Moreover, this short circuit between Dante's declarations about himself and the study of his life seems to be at the very center of the most recent season of studies. I'll take a couple of examples. The most debated topics about Dante's biographies in recent years are perhaps the question of the nobility of his family and the question of the moment and the reasons for his departure from the group of the White Guelphs after his exile. But none of them are actually properly speaking, historical facts, in the sense that no archival source presents any positive evidence of the Alighieri's belonging to the aristocracy or of Dante's clash with his former companions. At the very maximum, they present Dante as being close to them up to a certain point and then far removed from them. Nevertheless, these two topics, the nobility and the break, were at the very center of the new historical wave of studies. Why? Because Dante mentions them. in a key episode of his poem, I Canti di Cacciaguida, Paradiso 1517. I will come back to this in a moment. Another concern was the one about another unsettling trend in recent studies. Another major discussion of recent years involved the partisans of the so-called Guelfism of Dante, who, following Carpi's lead, argued that after his exile, Dante sought the protection of the Black Guelphs, his former political enemies in Florence, to be readmitted to Florence. This had been a striking thesis defended in that years by Carpi and Sant'Agata, because it conveyed the idea of a Dante that was, ready to jump onto a new party and to come close to the new winners just to gain the opportunity to be back in Florence. Meanwhile, the partisans of Dante's Ghibellinism, with fancy at the forefront, emphasized the precocity of his support for the imperial party. Without delving into many details, the problem with this discussion is that it was simply ill-formulated. Historical research does not envision any longer Guelph and Ghibellines or white and black Guelphs, and not even Magnati and Popolani, as political social parties supported by a consistent ideology. But instead, they are usually envisioned as networks whose geometry constantly evolved under the pressure of specific events and personal circumstances. And once we admit this, in which terms we can still go on discussing Dante's support to the Guelph or to the Ghibellines? So daily cross-pollination among specialists of different disciplines is the precondition of true interdisciplinary research. It serves a specialist of Dante's text to explain to an historian all the ways in which Dante's text can be read. And of course, it serves an historian to explain to literary critics that out of the best intentions, they are using tools of analysis that have been long forgone in historical studies. And finally, we had a third concern, which was the recent surge of interest in Dante's life that had produced the proliferation of publications on minutiae, meaning secondary aspects of Dante's life that are likely impossible to be ascertained, and even if they were, would not change much to our understanding and comprehension of Dante. So we weren't concerned about the kind of effort put to establish really secondary things that are not key to the knowledge of Dante. And we were concerned about a double risk, I would say, of neo-positivism and somehow of historical determinism that was, pushing this trend. So all of this should give you what was our intellectual agenda at a glance. Our standpoint, our priorities, our concerns, or the drives we were concerned with. Then the question was how to translate this nice intellectual landscape into a book, which is a concrete object, right? It should have a beginning, it should develop somehow, and then possibly have an end. To do that, we gave ourselves some guidelines or some rules that are really briefly outlined at the end of the book. However, I must confess that we came to understand them even better while we were presenting the book after the publication. And today I will try to walk us through the 5 main rules that we established for ourselves. And I will try to offer some examples to show what they consist of and how they change our way of envisioning the life of Dante, and also to incorporate some feedback we received from our first readers. The previous rule that has been frequently quoted ever since is the so-called juxta propria principia principle. This Latin phrase simply signifies that we must examine each document and piece of evidence, whether it is historical or literary, whether it is provided by documents or by Dante himself, whether it is unintentional or entirely self-aware, in light of its unique and original context, and trying to use the most advanced tools available to us. It sounds simple, right? But actually it's not so much if we consider the case of Dante. First example, in 1283, at the age of 18, Dante solved the debt of obligation that he had inherited from his father, Alighieri II, to another creditor. The document that records this transaction has been traditionally interpreted as evidence of the sudden economic crisis of the family after the death of Alighieri. However, when considered through the lens of current historical research, the situation looks quite different. In Dante's Florence, this kind of transaction is totally common, is ordinary, and the reason for this is because creditors simply prefer to sell their obligation instead of recovering the money. And this was the reason for the development of an important financial market. At the same time, these documents, if we cannot prove that Dante's family was poor, is not insignificant. Based on it, Silvia Dacciati and Giuliano Milani were able to reconstruct the social network with which the young Dante was acquainted at the time. And, together with other evidence, this document suggests that the Alighieri belonged to an intermediary social group deeply rooted in their neighborhood, Porta San Piero, which allowed Dante to engage with the members of the most ancient and noble families without belonging to one of them, and at the same time to have interesting relationships, such as this one, with the members of the major guilds or the so-called popolo. In other terms, the long-standing discussion about the Alighieri's social status, you remember, were they noble, weren't they, can be easily solved without complicated hypotheses by simply considering archival evidence juxta propria principia. But the same is true for Dante's text. In the same year, 1283, Dante is believed to have composed one of his first sonnets. That's the very well-known A ciascun'alma presa e gentil core. This sonnet has been traditionally overinterpreted due to its inclusion in the Vita Nova, leading to question about its prophetic nature, its spiritual meanings, and even the possible revelatory nature of diseases from which Dante, as a young man, would have suffered. According to our rule, however, this sonnet should be, first of all, considered within its context, which is that of Florentine poetry at the beginning of the 80s, of the 13th century. In this context, exchanging poetry and riddles in poetic form and asking for others' advice on one's own experience and dream is again something extremely common, is a common pastime. Dante's case is no different from others that we know from his milieu. However, this sonnet is interesting insofar it already shows Dante's overinvestment in his self-presentation as a poet, as well as his ability to master the code of poetry in an outstanding way. These 14 lines contain a solemn address to other poets, the Ciascun'alma presa e gentil core, but also a working of a well-known topos from French literature, the topos of the Eton Earth, and a game that involves the perfect symmetry between the poets that are the addressees of the sonnet and the sender, the young Dante, who has his earth ripped out as is common in this topos. So considered juxta propria principia, this sonnet appears to be a meta-literary game aimed to solicit poetic response, thus including its author in the historical community of the rimatori of his time, a poetic debut. that actually worked pretty well, as we know, and as Dante recalls, not by chance. So I think that these two cases offer a good example of the benefit of systematically applying this rule, which entails resisting both Dante's self-interpretation and the wealth of scholarship on Dante. They also highlight the importance of appraising sources firsthand by reading them instead of relying on recollections or summaries. This methodological principle is reflected in the first unusual feature of our book, if we consider it a biography, that are the interludes that open every single chapter, by inviting the reader to read, first of all, and to compare two pieces of evidence, one from archival documentation and one from Dante's work, followed by a brief commentary. Of course, we could not present just an anthology. We would have liked to, but we had to write a biography. And so to tackle this challenge, we decided to share the material and the sources. Practically speaking, this approach resulted in another unique aspect of our book. Each chapter consists of two parts. The first, which is written by Giuliano, delves into the historical context and the life of Dante as we can reconstruct it based on archival evidence, while the second one, written by me, explores Dante's self-narratives during the same period. And here I'd like to pause 1 second, because this distinction is not so, perhaps it's not so simple or so evident as it could be, as it could seem. Some readers seem to have ignored it while they were reading the book. Others, they misunderstood it as a distinction between life and works, as if Giuliano's parts were the parts and Dante's life, and my parts were just an exposition of what Dante wrote. Whereas this is a technical distinction between life and life narratives. What happens and what at the same time Dante retells about himself. This distinction in reality is quite classical in historical studies. Someone can think about the distinction between involuntary and voluntary sources. Is a distinction posited by Mark Bloch and discussed by Carlo Ginzburg. Or also we could think about the distinction between documents and monuments. This is a notion that comes from Panofsky and then Jacques Le Goff. At the same time, playing with this, we never considered it as absolute, nor we contended that there must be a perfect correspondence between the type of sources we deal with and the discipline that should consider them. This distinction was more a practical one, recognizes that for the reasons that I've just explained, Giuliano can observe about the exchange of a credit obligation or about a sentence of banishment, things that are more interesting and reliable than what I could do, and of course vice versa. This is also why in the book there are some pieces of evidence that are somehow analyzed twice. This happens for some sonnets, like a Ciascuna Alma Presa, that are relevant in terms of social network, as I was saying before, and relevant, of course, as pieces of poetry. But it also happens, for instance, with the letters that are at the same time a piece of literary writings and actually documents, public writings. Was this distinction useful? This is a question. And we think it was, because it allowed us to take a step back and to break free from the short circuits that, as I mentioned earlier, were generated by centuries of freely and even wildly combining heterogeneous pieces driven by the agenda of Dante studies. I already mentioned the question of the nobility, so I won't come back to it. And I will consider instead another problem, which is the question of how to read the Vita Nova. As I was mentioning before, in order for for this method to be effective, it is necessary to examine facts and statements, history and stories that belong to the same period. Surprisingly, this rule prompted me to consistently provide a new reading of a well-known pieces of the puzzle. And this piece is the Vita Nuova. Traditionally, biographers have relied on the contents of the book to provide insight into Dante's early life and lyric production, as if it were a comprehensive source of biographical information. So usually in biographies, you will find the Vita Nuova discussed in relation to Dante's life in Florence in the 70s and the 80s, despite the fact that the book was actually written in the first half of the 90s. However, the rule that I gave to myself imposed me to discuss the Vita Nuova only in the second chapter, the one devoted to the life of Dante in the 90s. And at first, I must say that I experienced this rule as a form of intellectual violence. I told Giuliano many times that this book could not work. Why? Because actually I didn't have enough material to write about the 80s without the Vita Nuova. I could not even name Beatrice as Beatrice when writing of Dante in the 80s if I could not use the Vita Nuova. And even worse, it made no sense to me to discuss the Vita Nuova in the second chapter because this was the one in which Giuliano would have discussed and talked about Dante's first philosophical training in Florence and Dante's political career. Whereas to me, in my mind, the Vita Nuova belonged to Dante's early years, the Still Novisti, Guido Cavalcanti, and so to complete different world compared to the one of politics. It took me 1 year to be able to write a single line of these 2 chapters, and of course I had to reread everything that was available to me about the Vita Nuova and the Rime. But finally it worked, because it helped me to realize little by little that actually there are elements in the Vita Nuova that we cannot actually understand if we don't consider it as being part of the political landscape of the 90s. So somehow the other step forward was to recognize that the book itself was charged with an intentional strategy of self-accreditation within this cultural context, and particularly speaking to a certain milieu, which is the milieu of the mendicant orders, in front of which it made sense for Dante to try to explain why his previous production, so the love poetry one, was actually interesting and something completely respectable. So seen in this light, the usual gap between Dante's early lyric production and his soon-to-come political career appears to be less important, although I intentionally avoided proposing any form of causal connection. I never wrote that the Vita Nuova was written by Dante in order to, or with the plan of starting a political career. And I didn't, because this is something I cannot demonstrate based on the rules that I gave to myself. So, to recap, the method that I was trying to apply worked somehow against me or despite me, and finally forced me to try to think about usual problems such as the Vita Nuova and what is the project of the Vita Nuova in a different light from what this is usual. Of course, it's up to the readers to say if this is interesting for them and if this opens a different perspective or not. I will go much faster on the other rules because I don't want to annoy you or to bother you. One, which I've just mentioned for the case of the Vita Nuova, is the fact of operating with broad chronological slices. How do we articulate the different phases of a life? In the case of Dante's life, because of the influential weight of Dante's narratives that are all made of turning points and break, before, after Beatrice, before, after the death of Beatrice, before and after the conversion to philosophy, before and after the exile. Dante is a perpetual source of breaks and turning points. Biographers usually work with very small temporal segments, but they reorganize somehow respecting the life narratives established by Dante himself. We tried once more to break free, and we did that by assuming an organization in broad chronological slices that is inspired to the scheme of the ages of life that Dante himself defended. And basically, each slice corresponds to 10 years of his life. And of course, he is split in the two parts I described before. And needless to say, this is to oppose the tendency that I was mentioning before about minutiae, and particularly all the discussions surrounding the micro-dating of certain of Dante's works, or even some specific count of the Commedia, and so on. A line of inquiry that is perhaps interesting, but in which I'm not sure that we can have substantial discoveries if we do not have new philological evidence to discuss. The fourth rule has to do with silences and with voids. What do you do with that? Again, traditionally, what is done in Dante's biography is try to fill the gap, is try to guess what happened. If you think about Dante's life, the period that is the most discussed by scholars is the first period of Dante's exile, the first 10 years of his exile. Why? Because basically there is no archival evidence about it. So all becomes a discussion and somehow a treasure hunt to provide the most sophisticated conjecture, taking into account the political context, the historical context, and the reading that someone has of Dante's lines. We decided, and we say multiple times, that this is not the way in which we proceed. Every time that something is unknown in this biography, we simply affirm it. We make reference to the proposals that have been made without cutting, without providing our own solution, even in cases about which we authored some of the solution in the past. But since these are conjectures, we didn't admit them within the book. Now, this is something important to me because some readers took it as a kind of renunciation, as if we were taking a step back without, or as if we were extremely cautious and we didn't want to engage in some debate. This was the stance of Giorgio Inglese in his work, and this is a stance that I totally respect and I share, and so far it's very useful to at least pose a clear boundaries between what is a fact and what is a conjecture. But at the same time, in our case, we do, I think, something a little bit different. The reason why we're so careful about not filling these silences is because we want to interrogate them. There are cases in which silence is a completely revelatory historical data. One of these cases is the case that has to do with the last years of Dante and the length of Dante's stays in Verona. The ones among us who are more acquainted with the current scholarship know that this has been a huge topic of debate. Now, the fact is that there is not even one archival record preserving any evidence of a stay of Dante in Verona. What does it mean? Of course, we can take this in the simple negationistic way and say, oh, since there is no document, it means that Dante never stayed in Verona. I don't think this is a correct way of dealing with this problem. Or we can try to strive and to fill the gap. We know many scholars that have tried to do that by finding indirect evidence of Dante's stays in Verona. But the facts stay in a city like Verona that has a very sophisticated and well-working system of archival records, there is no trace of Dante. And this is telling us something. It's telling us that despite the length of Dante's days in Verona, he stayed there in a marginal position. He certainly never worked as a notary. He certainly never worked as a counselor to Can Grande or as a diplomat. He never had an official position in Verona. And this is something that from the biographical point of view is interesting, because it's also the reason that perhaps explains to us why Dante decided to move from Verona, no matter how long he stayed there, to another place, Ravenna, where he could have a much better position due to the different intellectual and professional network of the city. Much more provincial, if you want, but easier to enter. There are other kind of silences. Another thing that we make notice in the book, and is also about the last years of Dante, has to do with the eglogues. The eglogues are the last work by Dante, and as you certainly recall, is a response to the invitation that Dante had received by someone else, Giovanni del Virgilio, who somehow acting as a kind of cultural manager, was suggesting Dante to completely refashion his image. So to start writing in the vernacular, to move to Bologna instead of Ravenna, and to start writing not about the afterlife and God, but about political contemporary subjects. By the way, this kind of intellectual figure that Giovanni del Virgilio was describing, so someone who writes in Latin, who writes about contemporary subjects, and in Bologna, is the kind of intellectual profile that was the most accepted in a city also like Verona, and this is exactly the kind of thing that Dante doesn't want to do at all. And the eglogues are a response about all of this, defending his own conception of poetry and vernacular and so on. But interestingly enough, Dante does that, well, first of all, using the bucolic code, that of course is to be connected to Virgil and is an indirect way to also to show off how good he was at composing Latin poetry, precisely the moment when he was refusing to do that. Which is so Dantean, if you want, but also is a way to completely conceal himself. And this is so very true with the eglogues, that the first one is written at the first person, whereas the second one written by Dante, is written at the third person. So the character that somehow is representing Dante becomes a character among others. To me, or at least this is something that I try to suggest in the book, this is part of the strategic response to Giovanni del Virgilio. Giovanni del Virgilio was making a case about the possibility for Dante of separating himself, his empirical self, from the character narrator of the poem. The poem where he put his name forever within the poem, which is, as you know, a striking novelty for this kind of work. And Dante replied by giving what? A mask, not even himself. There is no trace that this self that is depicting in the eglogues actually has something to do with Dante, as at the same time it was portraying himself in his major work. So somehow the fact of respecting the silence is not, or listening to the sound of silence, is not just a way of being prudent or cautious, is a way to try to pose the basis to be able to accomplish a different hermeneutic activity, which is interrogating the silence. The last rule was the fact of trying to privilege a longue durée perspective. And to do that, both when considering Dante within himself and considering Dante beyond himself. So within himself, what we tried to do, but somehow something that the book did on its own, somehow despite us, was to realize that in the case of Dante, there are some actually quite striking continuities that we can find in all the different moments of his life. Again, the way in which traditionally the life of Dante is envisioned is a series of turning points and changes, because this is what Dante's life narratives have taught us. But when working in the way that I tried to describe, all of a sudden realized that there were questions, actually historical questions, such as the question of Dante's social professional status, or the question of the continuity of some networks, such as the mendicant orders, particularly the Dominican, or some friendship, for instance, the case of Cino da Pistoia, that are present in all different moments of Dante's life. And in the same way, there are some literary elements, such as the references Dante plays with in terms of life narrative and self-presentations, or the patterns, including the breaks I was talking about. And finally, a certain vision of the performative power of writing, and the way in which, when you write about something, you can change the way in which this thing appears, including your life, that are constant in Dante's production from the very beginning up to the end. Beyond Dante, the big question for us was to find ways to not to isolate him, not just because we were comparing Dante to other poets or to other people from the same times and contexts, but also because we tried to focus on what is the long history that made possible for someone like Dante to exist and to produce what he produced. This is something that is discussed particularly in the prologue, and this is more an attempt made, I would say, from the point of view, from the standpoint of political, social, and cultural history by Giuliano. And the other long-term perspective was, what did Dante change? So what implied for our cultural history the fact that there has been someone like Dante, and what it implied particularly for this specific question, which is the question of life writing and the importance that we commonly give to others and to their lives in our cultural landscape. This is something that we give for granted. We step into a bookshop and it's full of pictures and bodies of authors, but this is something completely new for the late medieval cultural landscape, and is also something that really does not exist in different cultures. So how Dante entered in this dynamic and contributed to create it. And this is something we discussed into the epilogue about the legacies of Dante. So I come to the limits, and I try to be as brief as I can. The first limit of this book, on which I think that Giuliano and I, we currently agree, and perhaps you too after having listened to me for so long, is the fact that it's extremely dense, is the density of the book itself. Our challenge was to find a middle ground, not to be, we wanted to be accessible, so we couldn't discuss all the methodological, for instance, details that I tried to share with you today, but at the same time, those implications were there. So we tried to find a balance and equilibrium, but at the same time, this has as a side effect the fact of having a book which is extremely dense. My hope, despite this intensity, is that the book could be a libro sornione. This is the definition that Sant'Agata used for the Vita Nuova, a tricky book, a book that seems to be easy, perhaps a little bit dense, but actually goes on working without you entirely realizing it. The second limitation of the book is the fact that actually in order to work, it requires the collaboration from the side of the readers. I described briefly the way in which the book works, is structured, and basically each chapter has the same pattern. There is a shock at the beginning, the two documents, well, the document and the extract from Dante's works. There is a little commentary just as a way into the chapter, and then there are the two parts. So the historical one on documents by Dante and the one on life narratives by me. There is not a paragraph giving you the comparison between the two. And this is not there, not because we weren't able to write it, but because we didn't want to write it. The idea was that we shared the evidence and we share our way of reading the evidence according to all the requirements that I illustrated, but at the same time is the task of the reader to connect the dots and to decide the kind of connection and causal connections that they feel exist among the two parts. Somehow this is very Dantean once more. Me sotto innanzi, no? Ormai per te ti ciba. Here's what we can give you, and it's up to you to come and to play with us and engage in this game. And finally, the last limit of questions has to do with the question of the exportability of all of this. This is a question that has been raised various times. Many people asked us if we thought that this is something that this form can be used for other subjects different from Dante. My honest answer is that we really created it to discuss the case of Dante, and this is a case that has some specificities because we have little archival documents and a lot of life narratives. But at the same time, I start thinking that this could be used for cases that are similar to Dante's case. For instance, for Francesco da Barberino, for someone like Petrarch, for Cesare Pavese, Fellini, Kane West. There are some personalities in the history of culture that have this same striking mix of self-telling or life writing and, of course, life. And it could be interesting to see how the same form and model and system of rules work when applied to these other cases. I also promised to discuss the future directions, but my stance has not changed. So the way in which I establish the future directions usually is by discussing with people. So I would say that if this has to be collaborative, it's up to you now, and this is how the direction can be discussed. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions, so maybe we can open the floor.
Thank you very much for the fascinating presentation, and also thank you for the for the biography, which was fascinating to me to read. I already had 3 points that I wanted to ask you before the presentation and then I'm happy that you touched 2 of them, which are the nobility and the eclogues. And those, about nobility, I was very happy to read what you wrote about the topic, because I'm not a dentist, but when I faced the problem, also for my dissertation, I was also asking to myself why, if a man is noble, needs in the beginning of his production to state that to define how people can be noble through not just talking about blood, but also about talking about nobility of soul. I mean, when you face the production of an author which is noble himself by blood, like for example Franco Sacchetti.
He doesn't need to justify himself
exactly.
in other, He's not going to argue for other form of nobility.
So really, but that was kind of refreshing for me to say, oh, okay, so we can believe what we read, because the problem here is exactly about Cacciaguida, the country of Cacciaguida, so what he's doing there, the manipulation probably there. So thanks for that chapter. Regarding the eclogues, I wanted to ask you, is it just a matter of language, or is it also a matter of genres? Because when Giovanni del Virgilio talks to him, wrote him in the Carmen, and says, okay, why did you write a comedy in vernacular? Okay, but a comedy, Virgilio would have never wrote in low style, and he responds using not a Carmen again, but an eclose, which we know that it was an example of low style in Latin production. So could it be a part of the response of Dante saying, okay, I can write in Latin, okay, but I will not respond to you with a Carmen, but with an eclose. And so you, Giovanni del Virgilio, will understand that Virgilio himself wrote in low style already. So it's also a matter of genres. That's a question. Sorry, I hope I explained myself. And the last point, and I'm done, I promise, regards Bologna, the Bologna of the young Dante, because I was very interested in reading the chapter, which touches probably the part of voice and silence, the problem of Bologna, and it seems to me that even if it's implied, okay, he could have been a student in Bologna, but he could. But it seems to me that the position of the author, which is Milani in this case, it's kind of positive. Okay, it seems to me that he believes that he could have been a student in Bologna.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know your opinion about that.
Okay, thank you so much. A lot of things to discuss about. Cacciaguida and the nobility, for sure. I would add something more, which is the fact that to me, what has been very striking about all the debate on nobility that actually originates from Carpi is the way in which, besides all the historical evidence, the kind of reading of the Canti of Cacciaguida from which it stemmed is quite a poor one. Meaning that, on the one hand, it's evident when we read the Canti of Cacciaguida that the theme of nobility is there once more again to develop a polemic against the human that believes so much into nobility as being something determined by blood. No? O poca nostra nobiltà di sangue, that's the opening of Paradiso 16. And at the same time, in the way that Dante has to put together this character, it's true that he says he's a knight, but his being a knight is connected to other two features that are way more important. So he's a crusader, he's a martyr for the faith, who was acknowledged or endowed to be a knight by a fair emperor, fair because he was going to do a crusade. We know that this is historically false, but these are the main lines of the character. And the other line is that Cacciaguida is someone who belonged to the population of Florence from the most ancient times. So there is not a theme of nobility independent from these other two themes that actually, to me, are the very heart of the portrait of Cacciaguida, and are the most important ones to understand what is the kind of self-narrative that Dante is establishing for himself in this Canti. So if you want, the discussions around Dante's nobility is problematic, both from the side of literary analysis and from the side of the way of reading historical evidence. The second question was about, remind me?
The eclose.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure is also a question of genre. Knowing that at the same time, the only distinction or subtlety I would introduce is about the intentional absence of genre for the commedia. So the relatively low style that goes with the epilogues is interesting as part of or way of destroying the hierarchy of genre that somehow Giovanni del Virgilio is offering him by classifying the commedia as something low because of its language, because of its contents compared to other form of epic poetry. And indeed, in this strategic debate, it makes sense to use another genre that is. Then the status of the bucolic genre in Middle Ages is way more complicated than this. But yeah, I can access going into this direction. And finally, the last question was about Bologna. I think that Giuliano's stance, and I'm respectful of his conclusion about this point, is a little bit different. The way in which that part of his work is structured is by making us reflect that there are two facts that we know about Dante's years in the 80s. So the presence in Bologna, we know that for sure because of the philological evidence, and the Battaglia di Campaldino that with Barbera has become now this huge thing, actually a common experience for people at the time of Dante. So if you want, in this case, for Florentine of his generation, what you had to do, or what you would commonly do, was to somehow spend some time in Bologna, because Florence and Bologna are so interconnected for various reasons from this point of view of studies, because there is no university in Florence, but for commercial reasons, political reasons, and so on. And you need to, because the commune is a popular one, and there is the leva obbligatoria, so if you have the age of Dante, you will be expected to be a Campaldino. So if you want, this is the classical case where it's not so much a question of what happened, but the kind of weight that we give to the evidence we have. So can we deduct from the fact that Dante spent some time, for sure, in Bologna, that he had regular courses of study? Can we argue on this basis that he was very much involved in Florentine politics because he was in Campaldino? We can't. This is a falso syllogism to say it with Dante. And I think Giuliano has a point.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
I think it's a wonderful book. Thank you for those things. I'm just a big fan. And I want to also compliment the scholarship. That it's a wonderful handbook would be too banal a word, but the aggiornamento of the scholarly discussion around all these questions is just a tremendous service, I think, to moving forward the scholarship, to have it in this very dense form.
You agree on the first limit, right? It's very dense.
It's like freeze dry, and you can open it up in endless ways. So just a couple of personal reactions. One, for me, it put on a completely different plane exceptionality of Dante as a literary artist, as a self-made man, as a literary inventor of himself. And I'm wondering, is that something that you would endorse? I mean, I know there's a lot of work about, the typology of intellectuals in the commune of the period, but what really comes out, I've found, and especially in the early chapters, is this. It seems like an extremely exceptional literary project of self-invention, of self-fashioning, if you will. We're used to thinking of that in terms of Petrarch or the Renaissance. But it's so that was one question. I mean, I feel like you really give a fresh perspective on that. And then I think of the 5 limits, the one that I find most intriguing is this silences and voids. I mean, it seems like there's so many areas of Dante scholarship where the silences and voids could be interrogated further in the way that you were giving some examples of. And one of the big silences and voids, and again, this is kind of a personal reaction to the book, and I'm curious if you've had other, or if this resonates with you. I don't think that, I think the big silence and void is between the fictional, we talked about this a little bit this morning, the fictional temporality of the journey and the empirical, historical temporality of the writing itself. And I have the impression that the scholarship has not interrogated that particular silence or void to it. I mean, we can all think of examples where people have discussed that, but it seems like there's so much more potential there. I'm thinking of Nino Pertollet's recent article on Paradiso 26, where he talks about there's a kind of breakdown, and there are, during the poem, a breakdown in this this division that Dante creates, you know, as from a structural point of view in the poem. And I'm wondering if you find too that there are other opportunities for interrogating that particular fault line or that particular void. It's true, for instance, that there's the geographical and spatial material that's in the book. None of it. It's all at the level of the fiction. There's no, you know, the other world, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradiso, import entirely the geography. All of the references are in another plane of reality. And there's a kind of tension. That's another void that's interesting to me. How did he manage that? And then the breakdowns are kind of interesting. Like in that canto that we were talking about today, 8, or is it at 9, when he says, he's talking about what he uses a present tense that completely reconstructs the future prophecy. In other words, he's giving a future prophecy about something that has already happened. It's one of those examples. But he kind of messes up in the execution of it.
You think of Falcon, the prophet? Yeah. Well,
I'm sorry to give you such a jump.
No. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. By the way, I should start by thanking you. I mean, it's great to have a reader like you sharing feedback and telling me that it works, right? That it gives you something. So you're really making me truly happy. Void and Silence. To me, all of this started with the chapter about Firenze il Profeta, of which I was talking before, because there I forced myself to do this very boring, if you want, activity, that is to see what of the history of Florence is described by the chronicles and what is in Dante. So, because the only way in which you can feel the silence, in which you can see the void, as if you have a term of comparison, because otherwise you simply you don't feel it. And this was for me exceptionally important to try to understand what are the main ideological lines of Dante's way of reconstructing the history of Florence and how this has certain implications about his own conception of himself or self-fashioning and so on. So I came from there. And if you think of it, contrary to some commonplaces in scholarship, for instance, in the case of Barbero, this idea that, you know, is 1300, not just because of the Jubilee, etc., but because it was the moment of the political career, and etc. This is precisely what is never there. Like the specific moment when Dante had the power is something that is never mentioned in the comedy. It's one of the biggest silence of the comedy. No one ever told him, you will become priore. They are making prophecies about everything. Why not about this specific? That's a kind of black box.
Yeah.
And I think it is because it was a complicated biographical moment to reread ex post. You couldn't read it just in a positive manner. because while the white guelphs had some important responsibilities, of which it was better not to talk too much, so he prefers to insist on when he break up from them, and at the same time he could not even talk of it only in a negative manner, because of course he had been implied. So how do you what's the balance there? The other silence and I completely agree with you on this point, that I came to realize was so massive in the comedy, is the silence about his presence as an author. So all our attention is always captured by the dichotomy between Dante the Pilgrim, the main character, and the narrator. But there is never a single reference to the time of the author. When he's talking about the time of the composition, if you want, it's only to insist upon the challenge of writing, the challenge of remembering, etc. But there is no external time. And as you were saying, there is no external landscape. And this is a striking silence. Also because this is something that already Parodi was noticing. There is one page of the book of Ernesto Giacomo Parodi, the Commedia, where he says, oh, come on, that's singular, that he never used any chance to say, oh, and this prophecy, by the way, happened, was realized. Which is something you could expect because it would make sense in the strategy of self-fashioning, and indeed Dante has never done it. So my own explanation, and the one that, as you know, that I share in the book, is somehow there is an intentionality of completely dissolve himself within the poem, and this is why I read in this way the silence in the epilogues. Like, it is an intentional project of completely immersing himself and disappear within this fabulous world he created for himself. That's the only explanation I can give me, but I think it's an open question. So for sure, there must be other ways to explore it, and also to show other aspects of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's so interesting that he's disappearing at the same time that he's obsessively constructing a perspective. Mm-hmm. Like even in the eclogues, it's just like in the comedy, he uses mapping to remap this invisible self. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, it's very there's a whole mapping program in the eclogues which is about situating the self in this place, which is not a place, if you will, but it's the place of author. It's a longue durée strategy, I think, in his.
Yeah, there's also something that started very early. So I don't want to give letture psicologizzanti,
Yeah.
But talking about continuity, when I was forced to look his trajectory from the beginning to the end, all of a sudden it made sense. Like you have a very obsessive young man who composed love poetry with an intensity that actually you don't find in any other people around him, that ends up his life after many different experiences and of course new knowledge that he is able now to master, etc. It ends up creating a virtual world. But you can find in this instance, in this tension, the same obsessive nature that was somehow present from his early production. Then this is something I'm saying now, and not that we are in private. I didn't write it in the same manner, but to me there is a continuity there, which is important. And I skipped your first point, I think. No, you had
Well,
enough.
the thing about, it comes across as so exceptional.
Yeah.
This idea that he has no profession, he has no status, he has no place in the world except through this literary activity.
That's the true bet of in terms of positive thesis that we defend, the true bet of this biography. Because the situation is such, we don't have any evidence of any profession for him strictly defined. There is no evidence of that. So either we go on trying to argue that actually he had one, but the records are missing, and for some reasons he didn't practice it, or we must admit that he didn't, and try to start to see or to ask ourselves if the literary production makes sense or makes more sense once you consider that actually he didn't have a profession. And also the biographical itineraries of the exile become much more understandable once we think of it, because an author would have found a position in one of the cities surrounding Florence much easier, and many of them did. Same thing for a noble one. They had their own networks. They would have like a secondary branch of the families and were able to host them. If we look at the itineraries of the Cerchi after the exile, it's something manageable. Whereas for someone like Dante, who was in between and during his youth somehow spent his time trying to get closer to people who had a more stable position than what he had, after the exile, after the banishment, it becomes really complicated because there is no more the neighborhood to support you. Sorry, I'm digressing.
Thank you.
I scared you.
I think that might be a good place to conclude. Maybe we could take an opportunity again to thank our guest, our speaker, Elisa Brilli, for